My name is Pawan Sood. My father's name was Gurdayal Sood, and this is a story about his life for Colourful Heritage. Dad was born, we think, around about 1916, because dates are obviously at that time there was not really any great record keeping, especially in small villages. He was born in a village called Noor Mahal, which was about 50 miles in Punjab, but about 30-40 miles away from Jalandhar, so kind of central Punjabish. My father came to Scotland in 1947, probably late autumn, because he told me that he was the first Indian man to come to Glasgow after partition, which was on the 15th of August 1947. So he came here through necessity, the necessity being that families were quite large at that time. The country was not maybe in its best condition. It had obviously gone through some turbulent times. Trying to make money or trying to keep a family going was particularly difficult. Families were quite large, and my father was the eldest, and he probably had a responsibility to try to see if he could do something that would perhaps try and help the family and his siblings and his parents as well. So he had an opportunity to come to Glasgow, and that opportunity was from a dear friend who happened to be a Muslim friend, and he suggested that my dad should come to Glasgow because he was living in Glasgow. He had come over maybe a few years earlier, and he promised that he would look after my dad for a short period, get him started in terms of what he was going to do, and then set him off on his merry way. And that's what happened. So my dad came probably, I reckon, September, October. He came over by sea. I think everyone was travelling by sea at the time. I think the passages were long, but I think that everyone was prepared to go through whatever they had to go through to get to where they wanted to be, in the hope that they were going to find a better life and something that they could take a hold of and try and build something for the family back home. When they first arrived, they obviously had a very poor command of English. They had a small amount of money, and basically what they were going to do was try and use that money and try and build that fund. So communication was probably quite difficult. It was one of those things that you had to try and learn the language, and you weren't doing it in any formal manner. It was just basically picking up words here and there. True to Forum, his friend, I'm afraid I don't know his name, did look after him and took him into his house and kept him for about 6 weeks. And within those 6 weeks, they decided that my dad was going to become what they called a travelling salesman at that time, affectionately known as Johnnie Pedlars in Glasgow. And so the plan that most of them had at that time was that they were going to go to a warehouse, and warehouses were dotted around all over Glasgow, and they would buy a suitcase and fill them with bits and bobs. So clothing, ladies' clothing, gents' clothing, and some kids' clothing. And then they would find an area, and what they would do is go and knock the doors and say, "Would you like to buy something?" On different days, he would go to different areas. So maybe Falkirk was a Friday, or or Stirling was a Wednesday. I can't remember, but he did travel out with the Glasgow area, and he seemed to do quite well. And he managed to build up a reasonable little business and a relationship with the people that he was dealing with. But then sometimes you have to look forward and say, what we're going to do that can maybe be a bit more. That can maybe provide a bit more money. He was obviously sending back whatever he had. In the early 50s, he had gone back to India a couple of times. And in that time, when he had gone back to the village, he had brought a couple of his own cousins. On every trip, he had brought one of them over and done what his friend had done for him. In other words, keep him for 6 weeks, set him up, and get them working as well, so that they could obviously send something back to their own families, because times were very difficult. So my mother arrived in 1954, and myself and 2 sisters were born here in the 50s. And at that time, I think my dad thought probably travelling on a daily basis was maybe not a good idea. Shops had become probably something that most people were kind of dabbling in and thinking we can make some money. So he bought himself a shop in Partick in the 60s, and he worked away there for about 10 years, then moved on to another one, and then retired quite quickly in mid-60s, early 70s, mid-60s I think. I mean, at that point in time there aren't that many Asian people here, so there were all sorts of colourful names as such for our people, which it just, that's the way maybe kids were at that time. So I think most people who were doing this kind of business, this travelling salesman, had soon realised that schools coming out, were never a good time to be wandering the streets, because the young kids would come and torment you, maybe throw a stone or so, or maybe call you a darkie, a packie, whatever it was. And so they all, I remember quite a few of them saying that, that 4 o'clock, 3:30, quarter to 4 was the time to jump on a bus and try and head back to Glasgow, because that was a challenge as such, but it wasn't an insurmountable challenge. And I think that anyone that goes from any country to another country is going to face some sort of challenges. I would like to say that I think my parents didn't suffer any great disadvantage, or they didn't find themselves in positions where their lives became particularly difficult to live. They were matched, and they were married at a very young age. And I think my mother tells us that she was married at the age of 14. But when that marriage took place, they were effectively, officially married, but they didn't live together. So my mother didn't come and live in my dad's or my grandparents' household until she was about 18 or 19. However, the marriage took place quite early on. So they're saying that, I think my mother was born in around about 1923. The marriage took place in 37, 38, but they probably didn't really start living together until about maybe 42, 43, 44, something like that, sometime during the Second World War. I think my dad's thoughts would probably have changed. He had gone back a couple of times. My eldest sister had been born in India, but as I said, my mother came in 1954. By that time, my dad had thought he's not going to go back. And even if they did harbour intentions of going back at a later date, it was his opinion that my mother should come over so that the family could be together as opposed to be in two separate countries. So she came over in 1954, 1955, 56 and 59. There were 3 other children born, and the family becomes kind of complete. We were quite close to our parents in the sense that we tried to help our parents, so the girls would no doubt be helping my mum. My dad had a shop at the time, as I had said earlier. I would be sent off to go there and help him out on a Saturday or a Sunday. And even if I wasn't able to do very much, at least I was keeping him company. He was keeping an eye on me, making sure I wasn't getting up to no good. Well, there was no mother in the 50s or 60s. My mother was probably one of the first Indian ladies to come to Glasgow in 1954, probably followed by maybe a handful, and right up until probably, I would say, the early 60s, there weren't that many Indian ladies here. I think that lots of men had come over with the same ideas that my dad had, and they were working away. Some of them had gone back and got married, and some of them were still waiting to go back to get married. But because the ladies had been born and brought up in India, and they had a cultural and religious heritage, they wanted to try and keep that going. And obviously it was going to be difficult because they didn't have a centre and they didn't have a place of worship. So at that time what they did was that maybe about 10 ladies got together, and it was a Tuesday. They would get together and they would go and sing some of our bhajans, hymns, and they would make a point of remembering our religion and getting ready for any religious functions that were coming, so that if it was Diwali, it may well be celebrated in one person's house. So people would be saying, right, well, we're going to have the religious part in our house, we might have the food somewhere else. So there was a lot of coming and going between people, and there was a closeness and a close-knit community. The ladies, when they met, always put a little bit of money in front of any deities that they had brought over with them, and that money was saved. and that was the basis of a deposit for a building in Great George Street. And I think the men at that time got involved as well, and people put whatever they could, and they managed to buy this building in Great George Street, and on the upper floor they made that into the temple. In terms of identity, I think my parents and even my generation still see ourselves as Indian. However, we're born and brought up here. We hold British passports. We work in the UK. We contribute to this economy. We do in terms of our identity, I think that we are always going to be Indian. I think that we are always going to be Hindus. We're Hindus. But I do think that I do think there's an awful lot of basically crossing over as such. So I think there is a large mix between cultures, and I think, but whilst that doesn't change your identity, it changes the way that you live your life and the way that you act in your life. We learn so much as we go through life, and I think that what we have to do is try and pass on all the good things and try and keep away from the bad things. I think that in life, when you're living in a country that is not necessarily when you're talking about identity, not your origin as such, I think what you have to do is you have to be open-minded in terms of how you live your life. I think what you have to do is you have to make every effort to integrate. I think what you also do is have to make every effort to contribute. And I think what you have to do is you have to make sure that people still remember that you have an identity and try and retain that, but at the same time integrate into a community which is not necessarily yours.